The cold wind whistled through the quiet streets of Oakwood as Daniel Carter walked toward Harper's Cafe. His boots made soft sounds against the pavement, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him. The morning was crisp, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and blue. He had always loved mornings like these, peaceful, fresh, and full of promise. Daniel had been coming to Oakwood for a few weeks now. It was a small town, quieter than the cities he had been stationed in during his years in the Army. After serving his country for over a decade, he had returned to civilian life, looking for a place to settle. Oakwood had seemed like a good choice. It had friendly neighbors, small local businesses, and streets lined with old trees that told stories of the past. He had heard about Harper's Cafe from a few people around town. It wasn't the biggest or the most popular spot, but it had been there for years. People said it had strong coffee, warm pastries, and a history that made it a part of Oakwood's heart. Today, Daniel decided to give it a try. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The warmth of the cafe wrapped around him, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and toasted bread. The soft hum of conversation filled the air, blending with the gentle clinking of cups and plates. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Daniel walked toward the counter, his steps steady but unhurried. He noticed the wooden tables, some occupied by early customers reading newspapers or typing on their laptops. A couple sat near the window, whispering to each other with small smiles. A young waitress, with light brown hair tied in a ponytail, moved between the tables with a tray in her hands. Behind the counter stood a man in his 60s with silver-streaked hair, wearing a brown apron over his checkered shirt. His name tag read Walter Harper. His sharp eyes scanned Daniel as he approached. There was a flicker of something in them, a look Daniel had seen before, a look that made his shoulders tighten just slightly. Daniel placed his hands on the counter, nodding politely. "Morning. Just a black coffee, please." For a moment, Walter didn't answer. He simply stared, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, his lips curled, not in a smile, but in something colder. "We don't serve people like you here." The words were quiet but sharp, like a whisper carrying the weight of a storm. The cafe, once filled with soft chatter and movement, seemed to freeze in time. The waitress stopped mid-step, her tray tilting slightly. The couple near the window exchanged glances. A man in the far corner, who had been hidden behind a newspaper, lowered it just enough to see what was happening. Daniel's fingers curled slightly against the counter. He had heard these words before. Maybe not in the exact same way, but the meaning was always the same. He had faced it in different places, in different voices, sometimes with polite smiles, sometimes with open cruelty. But it never changed. His jaw tightened for just a second, but his voice remained calm. "Excuse me." Walter leaned in slightly, his arms resting on the counter. His eyes, still locked on Daniel's, held no warmth. "You heard me." A heavy silence settled over the cafe. The waitress took a small step forward, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. The man in the corner closed his newspaper and sat up straighter, his sharp blue eyes observing every detail. Daniel didn't move. He had fought battles on foreign soil, had faced storms far worse than this. But this was the battle that never seemed to end. He exhaled slowly. "I fought for this country," he said evenly, his voice carrying no anger, only quiet strength. "What have you done?" For a brief second, something flickered in Walter's expression. Surprise, maybe, or something close to hesitation. But it was gone just as quickly. "This is my cafe," Walter said, his voice lower this time. "I decide who's welcome." Daniel looked around. The warm lights of the cafe suddenly felt dimmer. The inviting atmosphere had turned cold. The waitress shifted nervously, gripping the edge of her tray. She looked at Walter, then back at Daniel, her face torn between fear and something else. Maybe regret, maybe shame. The couple near the window gathered their things, clearly uncomfortable. They didn't say anything, but the way they hurried to leave spoke volumes. The man in the corner, who had remained silent until now, finally stood up. His suit was neatly pressed, his shoes polished, and there was something in his presence that demanded attention. He walked toward the counter, his footsteps firm but unhurried. He stopped next to Daniel, his sharp blue eyes fixed on Walter. Then, calmly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a state licensing bureau badge. Walter's face lost its color. The waitress gasped softly, her fingers gripping the tray tighter. A few customers who had been pretending not to listen suddenly looked up with wide eyes. The man closed the wallet and slipped it back into his coat. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he spoke. "You sure about that?" Walter opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence in the cafe now felt different, not just tense, but charged with something new. The moment had shifted. The power in the room had changed hands. Daniel didn't move, didn't say a word. He just watched. The battle wasn't his to fight anymore. It had just begun. The cafe had gone silent after Walter's sharp words. The only sound was the distant hum of the coffee machine and the occasional clink of a spoon against ceramic. A heavy tension filled the air, pressing down on everyone inside the small space. Daniel stood still, his hands resting on the counter. He had been in situations far worse than this. He had faced danger in places where survival was not guaranteed. He had fought for his country, worn the uniform with pride, and carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. And yet, moments like this, moments where his dignity was questioned, where he was treated as less than, cut deep. Walter, standing behind the counter, crossed his arms. His expression remained firm, like he had made up his mind and would not change it. "I don't want any trouble," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. Walter smirked slightly, shaking his head. "Then take your business somewhere else." A chair scraped against the floor as a woman near the window shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A young waitress named Emma stood frozen, gripping the tray in her hands, her face pale. The man in the navy suit, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, folded his newspaper slowly. His sharp eyes studied the scene, watching every movement, every word exchanged. Daniel inhaled deeply. He had a choice. He could turn and walk away, pretend that this didn't bother him. It would be easy, wouldn't it? Just another day, another moment where he let things slide. But why should he? Why should he accept this? "You think you can treat people however you want?" Daniel asked, his voice steady. Walter shrugged. "I run my business how I see fit." Daniel nodded slowly, a bitter smile on his lips. "You run a business, but you turn away paying customers." Walter leaned forward slightly. "That's right." The cafe was still. The tension was thick, filling every corner of the small shop. A couple sitting near the door exchanged a glance. The man, dressed in a flannel shirt, cleared his throat uncomfortably. The woman beside him whispered something, her expression uneasy. Emma, still holding the tray, took a small step forward. She looked at Daniel, then at Walter. Maybe we should just serve him the coffee," she said quietly. Her voice was almost pleading, like she knew where this was headed and wanted to stop it. Walter shot her a sharp look. "Stay out of this," he snapped. Emma flinched, stepping back. Daniel let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. It wasn't the first time he had faced this. He had seen this kind of behavior in different places, from different people. The faces changed, but the attitude remained the same. "You know," Daniel said, meeting Walter's eyes, "I served this country." Walter's expression didn't change. "Good for you." "I put my life on the line," Daniel continued, "for people like you." Walter's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond. The man in the navy suit tilted his head, his expression unreadable. He was still watching, his fingers resting on the edge of his cup. Daniel sighed. "I thought maybe people had changed, that maybe things were different." Walter scoffed. "Things are how they've always been." A few customers shifted in their seats, some looking away, others pretending to focus on their phones or coffee cups. No one spoke. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. He could walk away. He could leave and never come back. But why should he? Why should he be the one to leave? He turned slightly, glancing at the man in the navy suit, who was still watching him. There was something in his gaze, something sharp, something calculating. Walter tapped his fingers against the counter impatiently. "You done?" Daniel studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Yeah, I'm done." He took a step back, but before he could turn, the man in the navy suit stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. It caught everyone's attention. Walter's expression shifted slightly as the man walked toward them. He was taller than he had seemed sitting down, his presence commanding in a way that made people take notice. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, flipping it open with a practiced motion. The light caught the surface, and Emma gasped softly. It was a badge. The cafe went completely silent. Walter's face paled as he stared at it. "What?" The man's voice was smooth, calm, but held an undeniable authority. "My name is William Hastings," he said, slipping the badge back into his pocket. "I work for the State Licensing Bureau." The words hung in the air, sinking in. A couple of people exchanged surprised glances. Emma's lips parted slightly, realization dawning in her eyes. Walter's hands twitched slightly. He cleared his throat, trying to recover. "Look, I don't want any trouble." William raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting, because it looks to me like you're the one causing trouble." Walter forced the smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "This is just a misunderstanding." William's gaze didn't waver. "Is that so?" Walter swallowed hard. He looked at Daniel, then at William, then back at Daniel. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said quickly. Just a policy I've had." William nodded slowly, as if considering the words. Then he turned slightly, glancing around the cafe. "How many of you have been here before?" he asked casually. A few people hesitated before raising their hands. William nodded again. "And how many of you have seen this kind of thing happen before?" The hesitation was longer this time, but a few more hands went up. Walter's expression tightened. "Now wait a minute." William held up a hand. "I'm just asking questions." Daniel watched the exchange silently. He wasn't sure what William was planning, but he had a feeling it wasn't going to end well for Walter. William turned back to Walter. "Here's what's going to happen," he said evenly. "I'm going to make a report, and based on what I've seen, I'd say your business is in violation of some very important regulations." Walter's face turned red. "Now listen, I've been running this place for years." William didn't blink. "And I'll be looking into whether you'll be running it much longer." Silence. Walter opened his mouth, then closed it again. Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm. "I just wanted a cup of coffee." William nodded. "And you should have gotten one." Walter's shoulders slumped slightly. Daniel glanced around the cafe, at the people who had been watching, at the ones who had been too afraid to speak. He took a deep breath and turned toward the door. "Come on," William said. "Let's go somewhere that actually deserves customers." Daniel nodded, and together, they walked out, leaving Walter standing behind the counter, his face pale, his hands shaking. The cafe doors swung shut behind them. The cafe doors swung slightly as Daniel and William stepped outside, the cold air brushing against their faces. The street was quiet, only a few people walking along the sidewalk, wrapped in their coats. Daniel exhaled, watching the white mist of his breath disappear into the air. He should have felt relieved to be out of that place, away from the tension, away from the hostility. But something inside him was unsettled. He looked back through the cafe window. Walter still stood behind the counter, his hands resting on the surface, his face tense. His cafe wasn't just any small-town coffee shop. It was a reflection of his power in this community, a power that he had used unfairly for years. But for the first time, Daniel saw something else in his eyes: uncertainty. William stood beside him, adjusting the cuffs of his navy blue suit. He wasn't in a rush. He had been in situations like this before, where people like Walter thought they could act however they'd wanted without consequences. But things had changed. This wasn't going to be ignored. Daniel turned to him. "That man," he said, nodding toward the cafe window. "He thinks he can treat people however he wants." William's lips curved slightly, but there was no amusement in his eyes. He's about to learn otherwise. Inside the cafe, the silence had turned into murmurs. Customers who had witnessed the exchange were whispering to each other, stealing glances at Walter. Emma, the waitress, still stood near the counter, her hands gripping the edge of her apron. She had never seen Walter look this shaken. A man sitting by the window, dressed in a gray sweater, leaned toward his wife. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "That man, he had a badge." His wife nodded, her eyes still on the door. "Do you think he was serious?" At the far end of the cafe, another customer pulled out his phone and started typing. Within seconds, the scene that had just unfolded was being shared. A few words, a quick post, and suddenly, people outside the cafe were beginning to take notice. Walter ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He had never imagined that today would turn out like this. He had thought nothing of turning Daniel away. Just another customer, just another day. But now his hands felt clammy, and his heart pounded in his chest. The cafe door opened again, and this time, William stepped back inside. The soft jingle of the bell rang through the space, cutting through the murmurs. All eyes turned toward him. Walter straightened his posture, trying to mask the unease that had settled in his chest. "Look," he started, forcing a chuckle. "I think we got off on the wrong foot." William didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took slow steps forward, his gaze steady. "Did we?" he asked. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it that made everyone listen. Walter let out a nervous laugh, glancing around as if expecting someone to step in and support him. But the room remained quiet. "It was just a misunderstanding," he continued. "Nothing personal." William's eyes didn't waver. "A misunderstanding?" Walter nodded quickly. Yeah. I mean, sometimes things come out the wrong way. You know how it is." Emma, still standing nearby, lowered her gaze. She had worked at this cafe for months, had seen how Walter treated certain customers. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It had never been a misunderstanding. William took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the badge again, letting the light catch it as he held it up. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Walter swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah." "Then you know what it means," William continued. His voice remained steady, but there was no room for argument. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about whether you should be allowed to run a business at all." A ripple of reaction moved through the cafe. People exchanged looks, shifting in their seats. This was bigger than they had expected. Walter's hands tightened into fists at his sides. "You can't just walk in here and—" William cut him off. "I can," he said simply. "And I will." The cafe door opened again, and this time, a woman in a black coat stepped inside. She looked around, taking in the scene before walking directly toward William. Walter's stomach sank as he recognized her. Rachel Simmons, a local journalist. She had been covering community affairs for years, and if she was here, it meant one thing: this wasn't going away quietly. Rachel pulled out a small notepad and pen. "Mr. Hastings," she said, addressing William, "I just received reports that an incident took place here this morning. Would you be willing to comment?" Walter felt the blood drain from his face. William turned to her and nodded. "I can confirm that I witnessed discriminatory behavior in this establishment," he said. "I will be filing an official report." Rachel scribbled down his words, her pen moving swiftly across the paper. "And what does that mean for this business?" William glanced at Walter. then back at Rachel. "It means," he said, "that there will be consequences." The cafe was completely silent now. Walter tried to steady his breathing. "You can't do this," he said, though his voice had lost its strength. William's gaze was unreadable. "Can't I?" Rachel turned to Walter. "Would you like to share your side of the story?" she asked. Walter opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? That he hadn't meant it, that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the truth was staring him in the face. The people in the cafe had seen it. The man with the badge had seen it. And now the whole town was about to hear about it. He clenched his jaw, looking away. Rachel took a few more notes before closing her notepad. "Thank you for your time," she said. She turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the floor. As she stepped outside, she pulled out her phone. Within minutes, the news would spread. Walter felt a cold dread settle over him. William slipped his badge back into his pocket. "I suggest you think about what happens next," he said. Walter didn't respond. William turned and walked toward the exit. He paused by the door, glancing over his shoulder at Emma. "If you ever need a reference for another job," he said, "let me know." Emma blinked in surprise, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said softly. And with that, William stepped outside, leaving the cafe in silence. The customers sat still, processing everything that had just happened. Some picked up their cups again, though their coffee had long gone cold. Others exchanged quiet whispers. Emma let out a shaky breath and turned to Walter. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. For the first time since she had started working here, he didn't seem untouchable. The cafe door remained open for a long moment before slowly swinging shut. The cafe felt different now. The air was heavier, the silence stretched longer, and every movement seemed slower, more careful. Walter stood behind the counter, gripping its edge, his fingers pressing hard against the wood. His breathing was steady, but there was a tightness in his chest that he couldn't shake. He had never felt this way before, not in his own cafe, not in a place he had controlled for years. Emma stood nearby, her apron still neatly tied around her waist. She stole a glance at Walter, watching the tension in his face. She knew he was angry, but for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. His usual confidence was gone. His hands twitched slightly, his knuckles white against the countertop. Outside, William and Daniel were walking away, their figures disappearing down the street. The cafe's customers slowly returned to their conversations, though their voices remained hushed, as if the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. Walter exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning hair. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He had been running this place for over a decade. He had dealt with difficult customers, handled complaints, and made his own rules. And yet, in a single morning, everything had changed. The door opened again, the small bell jingling softly. Walter looked up quickly, half expecting William to return. But instead, a woman walked in. She was in her 40s, dressed in a crisp black coat, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. She held a leather folder in her hands, her expression unreadable. Walter straightened, forcing a polite smile. "Can I help you?" The woman stepped forward, stopping just short of the counter. She placed the folder down and opened it with careful precision. Inside were neatly stacked papers, official-looking. Walter's stomach twisted slightly. "My name is Linda Porter," she said, her voice professional, yet firm. "I'm from the City Business Council." Walter felt a chill run down his spine. Linda tapped the top paper with her finger. "I received a report this morning," she continued, her eyes locking onto his. "It seems there have been complaints about your establishment." Walter's jaw clenched. "Complaints?" Linda nodded. "Multiple, actually. Some from today, others from previous incidents that were never formally reported." Emma swallowed hard, glancing between them. She had worked here long enough to know this wasn't just about what happened with Daniel. There had been other moments, Other times Walter had refused service to certain people, spoken harshly, or acted as if his cafe was only meant for a select group. Walter forced a chuckle. "Look, I think this is all being blown out of proportion. It was just a misunderstanding." Linda didn't react. "Is that so?" she asked, her voice cool. Walter nodded quickly. "Yeah. I mean, people get upset over small things all the time." Linda studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her folder and pulled out a printed email. She slid it across the counter. "This was sent to our office less than an hour ago," she said. Walter hesitated before picking it up. His eyes scanned the words, his grip tightening as he read. The email was from William Hastings. It detailed everything that had happened in the cafe. The way Walter had refused to serve Daniel, the words exchanged, the reactions of the customers. But it didn't stop there. It also included a request for a full review of Walter's business license. Walter's heart pounded. Linda crossed her arms. "Discrimination is a serious issue, Mr. Hayes," she said, using his last name for the first time. "And it's not something we take lightly." Walter's mouth was dry. He had dealt with angry customers before. He had faced bad reviews online. But this was different. This was official. This had consequences. He stopped himself, unsure of what to say. Linda continued, "I'll be conducting a review of your establishment over the next few weeks. That includes speaking to your employees, reviewing past complaints, and assessing whether your business is in violation of any city regulations." Walter's pulse quickened. "You can't just shut me down," he said, his voice rising slightly. Linda remained calm. "Not yet," she said. "But if we find evidence of repeated violations, that could change." Walter's hands clenched into fists. "This is my cafe," he said, his voice low but tense. Linda didn't flinch. "Then I suggest you start treating it, and your customers, like it's worth keeping." She closed her folder and picked it up. "Expect a formal notice soon," she said. With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Walter stood frozen, his thoughts racing. He wanted to argue, to fight back, but deep down, he knew he was trapped. The door swung shut behind Linda. For a long moment, the cafe was silent. Then, slowly, the murmur of voices returned, people whispering to one another, their eyes still darting toward the counter. Walter inhaled sharply, then turned his gaze to Emma. She stiffened under his stare, gripping the fabric of her apron. "You knew about this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, but edged with frustration. Emma shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't." Walter studied her for a moment longer, then let out a harsh breath. He wiped a hand over his face, feeling the weight of everything settle onto his shoulders. This wasn't over. But for the first time, he wasn't sure how to fight back. The small diner at the corner of Maple Street had a warmth to it that felt welcoming. The scent of fresh coffee and homemade biscuits filled the air, and soft music played in the background. The place wasn't fancy, just a simple spot with wooden tables, a counter lined with stools, and framed pictures of smiling customers on the walls. It was the kind of place where people knew each other, where regulars had their favorite booths, and where strangers were greeted with kindness. Daniel sat at a table near the window, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The warmth seeped into his fingers, a contrast to the cold air outside. He glanced around, taking in the easy conversations happening at the other tables, the laughter from the staff behind the counter, and the gentle hum of a place that felt alive. For the first time that day, he felt at ease. The door opened, letting in a rush of cool air as William stepped inside. He spotted Daniel right away and walked over, his movements relaxed. "How's the coffee?" William asked as he took a seat across from him. Daniel lifted the cup slightly. "Better than the last place," he said with a small smile. William chuckled. "I figured." He waved over a waitress, who approached with a bright smile. "I'll take whatever he's having." The waitress nodded, coming right up. As she walked away, Daniel exhaled, looking out the window. "You know," he said, It's strange how something so small can change how a place feels. It's just coffee, just a table, just a diner. But somehow it feels different. William leaned back in his chair. Because places aren't just about what's in them, he said. They're about the people. Daniel nodded slowly, taking another sip of his coffee. Yeah, he murmured. For years, he had walked into places like the one that had refused him service, places where the unspoken rules were clear, where some people were welcome and others weren't. He had seen it too many times. But sitting here, in this diner, he was reminded that not every place was like that. The waitress returned, setting a fresh cup of coffee in front of William. "You boys need anything else?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "This is perfect." She smiled warmly. "Well, take your time. Stay as long as you like." As she walked away, William glanced at Daniel. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee, "people are going to hear about what happened at Walter's Cafe." Daniel sighed. "They already have." William raised an eyebrow. "You saw something?" Daniel nodded toward his phone, which rested on the table. "It's all over the local news. People are talking." William wasn't surprised. He had seen it before. How one moment could change the way a town looked at someone. Walter had built a reputation over the years, but now that reputation was being questioned. "Do you think he'll change?" Daniel asked, though there was no real hope in his voice. William took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Some people don't change," he said honestly. "But what matters is that they don't get away with it anymore." Daniel let out a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You sound like someone who's been through this before." William gave a small nod. "I have." Daniel studied him for a moment. He had known William for years, but there were parts of his story he had never asked about. "You ever had a moment like this?" Daniel asked. William's fingers tapped against his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said quietly. "More than once." Daniel didn't press him for details. Some things didn't need to be said. The diner door opened again, and this time Emma stepped inside. She hesitated at the entrance, glancing around as if unsure whether she should be there. Daniel noticed her and raised a hand in greeting. "Emma." She smiled, walking over to their table. "Mind if I join you?" "Of course," Daniel said, gesturing to an empty chair. She sat down, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. There was a nervousness in her eyes, but also a quiet determination. "I just wanted to say." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm sorry for what happened back there." Daniel shook his head. "It wasn't your fault." Emma sighed. "Maybe not, but I still stood there. I should have said something." William watched her closely. "Are you still working there?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "I quit." Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Really?" Emma nodded. "I couldn't stay after what happened. It didn't feel right." William gave her an approving nod. That took courage. She exhaled. "I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I just couldn't be part of that anymore." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You'll find something better," he said. "Someplace where you don't have to choose between your job and doing the right thing." Emma smiled, though there was uncertainty in her eyes. "I hope so." William pulled a small notepad from his pocket and scribbled something down. He tore the paper and slid it across the table to Emma. She picked it up, reading the name and phone number. "A friend of mine runs a restaurant downtown," William said. "They're always looking for good people." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "You think they'd hire me?" William smiled. "I think they'd be lucky to have you." Emma stared at the paper for a moment before tucking it into her pocket. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel watched the exchange, feeling something shift inside him. It wasn't just about what had happened earlier. It was about what happened next. Emma had walked away from a job that didn't align with her values. Walter was facing consequences for his actions, and this small diner, warm and welcoming, reminded Daniel that there were still places where people were treated with kindness. As they sat together, sipping coffee, the tension from earlier slowly faded. The world was full of places that didn't feel right, but it was also full of places that did, and sometimes that made all the difference. The streets were quieter than usual that morning. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. People moved about, but there was something different in the way they walked, the way they looked at each other. A shift had taken place in the town, and no one could ignore it. Walter sat alone in his cafe, staring at the empty tables. The morning rush had come and gone, but it hadn't been like before. A few customers had walked in, ordered their coffee, and left quickly. Some of the regulars hadn't come at all. And then there were those who entered, glanced around, saw him behind the counter, and turned right back out the door. He could feel it, the weight of their judgment, the whispers, the unspoken words hanging in the air. The newspaper sat in front of him, folded open to an article with a bold headline: Local cafe owner faces backlash after discrimination incident. Walter clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edge of the paper. He had expected some noise after what happened, but this. The story had spread faster than he thought possible. Customers had posted about it online. The city business council was investigating him. Even some of his suppliers had called, asking questions in voices that held quiet disapproval. He slammed the paper shut, his hands shaking with frustration. The door opened with a small jingle. Walter looked up, half expecting another reporter, but instead, it was Greg, one of his longest customers. Greg was a man in his 60s, always wearing a pressed button-up shirt and a thoughtful expression. He had been coming to the cafe for years, always ordering the same thing: a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. Walter forced a smile. "Greg, good to see you." Greg didn't smile back. He walked up to the counter, placed a $5 bill on it, and slid it forward. "Just coffee today," he said, his voice unreadable. Walter hesitated before pouring the coffee. As he placed the cup in front of Greg, he cleared his throat. "People are making too big of a deal about this," he said casually. "You know how things get blown out of proportion." Greg picked up the coffee but didn't take a sip. He looked at Walter, his gaze steady. "I heard what happened," he said. "I heard the words you used." Walter's stomach tightened. "Come on, Greg, you've known me for years. You know I'm not." Greg cut him off. "I know what I saw." His voice was quiet, but there was a firmness to it. "And I know what I can't ignore anymore." Walter stared at him. "You're really going to turn your back on me over one mistake?" Greg exhaled, shaking his head. "It wasn't just one mistake. It was a choice, and I don't think I can sit in this place knowing that." He left the money on the counter, turned, and walked out the door. Walter watched him go, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. The rest of the day passed in a blur. A few more people came in, some out of habit, some just to see what was happening. But the energy in the cafe had changed. It was no longer a comfortable place where people laughed and talked freely. It was tense, uncertain. By the time the afternoon sun hung low in the sky, Walter was exhausted. Not from work, there hadn't been much of that, but from everything else. And then the door opened again. Emma. She stepped inside, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. She looked around, noting the empty tables before meeting Walter's eyes. He crossed his arms. "What do you want?" She walked up to the counter but didn't sit down. "I wanted to see for myself," she said, "how things are going." Walter let out a bitter laugh. "Take a good look. Business is slower, people are talking, and now even my regulars don't trust me. Happy?" Emma didn't flinch at his tone. "This isn't about me being happy, Walter." She studied him, her gaze softer than he expected. "Did you really think people wouldn't care?" Walter exhaled sharply. "People didn't care before." Emma shook her head. "They did. They just didn't say anything. But now they are." He rubbed a hand over his face. "So what? What am I supposed to do? Apologize? Beg people to come back?" Emma tilted her head slightly. Have you even thought about apologizing? Walter scoffed. I don't need to apologize for running my business the way I see fit. Emma sighed. And how's that working out for you? Walter had no answer. She shifted her weight. You know, I used to be proud to work here, she said. I used to think this place was special, that it was part of the town, part of the community. Walter frowned. It still is. Emma shook her head. No, a place where people don't feel welcome isn't part of a community. It's just a building. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the counter. Walter eyed it warily. What's this? Petition, Emma said simply. His stomach dropped. People are asking the city to revoke your business license, she explained. There are a lot of signatures. Walter swallowed. You signed it? Emma hesitated for only a moment before nodding. I did. His throat tightened. She tapped the paper. But you can still change things. Walter shook his head, laughing bitterly. You really think one apology is going to fix this? Emma's expression softened. I think owning up to your mistakes is a start. Walter looked away. Emma let out a slow breath. Think about it. She turned and walked toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she paused. People can forgive, Walter, but they have to believe you mean it. And then she was gone. Walter stood there for a long time, staring at the petition on the counter. For the first time, the weight of his choices pressed down on him, heavier than before. The sound of footsteps echoed in the nearly empty cafe. Walter stood behind the counter, staring at the door, waiting for someone to walk in. But the morning rush had come and gone without much of a rush at all. A couple of people had stopped by, grabbed their coffee to go, and left without lingering. It had been like this for days. The town had turned its back on him. The petition Emma had brought was gaining attention, and the city council had scheduled a meeting to discuss complaints against his cafe. Walter rubbed his hands over his face. He had built this place with years of hard work, but now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The bell above the door jingled, and for a moment, he hoped it was Greg, back to talk things over. But it wasn't Greg. It was Daniel. Walter tensed. He hadn't seen him since that day, the day he had told him to leave. Daniel stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He glanced around the cafe, his gaze lingering on the empty chairs. Walter cleared his throat. If you're here to make a scene, I don't need any more of that. Daniel shook his head. I'm not here for that. Walter frowned. Then why are you here? Daniel walked up to the counter, setting his hands on it. I came to see if you've learned anything. Walter scoffed. Learned what? That people like to turn on you when it suits them. Daniel studied him for a long moment before speaking. No, that respect is something you earn. Walter looked away. Daniel continued, his voice calm but firm. You think people are punishing you just for one mistake, but this wasn't just about me. It was about the way you treated people for years, the way you made them feel like they didn't belong. This town is finally holding you accountable. Walter swallowed, but he didn't respond. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. You could fix this, you know. Walter let out a dry laugh. Yeah. How? Daniel met his eyes. Apologize, not just with words, but with actions. Show people that you've changed. Walter sighed. And if I don't? Daniel shrugged. Then you'll lose everything. Silence filled the space between them. Then, Daniel reached into his pocket and placed a small card on the counter. Walter frowned. What's this? A veterans group is hosting a community event this weekend, Daniel said. They're raising money for local businesses, giving people a chance to come together. Walter raised an eyebrow. And you're inviting me? Daniel nodded. It's a chance to do the right thing. Walter stared at the card for a long time. He didn't know if he had the courage to face the town, to admit that he had been wrong. But deep down, he knew he didn't have much choice. The community center was buzzing with energy. People moved from table to table, chatting, laughing, sharing stories. There were booths set up with homemade goods, local artists displaying their work, and a food station serving warm meals. At the center of it all was Daniel, shaking hands, greeting old friends, making sure everyone felt welcome. Then, the room quieted. Walter had arrived. People noticed him immediately. Some whispered. Others crossed their arms, waiting to see what he would do. Walter cleared his throat. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding. He had never been good at this, at admitting when he was wrong. But this was his chance. He stepped forward and found Daniel watching him, waiting. Walter took a deep breath. I just want to say something. The crowd was silent. Walter hesitated before speaking again. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I know I've hurt people. He swallowed hard. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Walter continued, his voice steadier now. For a long time, I told myself that the way I ran my cafe was just business. But I see now that it wasn't just about business, it was about people. And I didn't treat everyone with the respect they deserved. His gaze swept the room. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I want to try. I want to make things right. Silence followed his words. Then Emma stepped forward. You really mean that? She asked. Walter nodded. I do. Emma studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. Then prove it. Walter exhaled. I will. The tension in the room softened. People exchanged glances, some still skeptical, but others willing to listen. Daniel stepped beside Walter, offering his hand. Walter hesitated before shaking it. It wasn't a perfect ending. Not everyone was ready to forgive, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was enough.